The Varinthian instructors stood frozen at the observation deck, their chitinous plates rippling with confusion. Below them, in the training habitat designed to test the apex predators of 12 different worlds, lay a scene that defied every protocol in their manual. The 3 Krell cubs, each the size of a Terran bear, with razor-sharp claws that could shred titanium and jaws capable of crushing starship hull plating, were curled protectively around a human. Not attacking, not feeding, sleeping. "Impossible," hissed Commander Zaxthar, his translator struggling with the emotion behind the word. "We spent 3 cycles teaching them human weaknesses. Pressure points, soft tissue vulnerabilities, the fragility of their spines." The human in question, one Frankie Chen according to the manifest, lay with his back against the habitat's artificial rock formation. One Krell cub had its massive head resting on his lap. Another pressed against his side, purring, a sound that Krell were not supposed to make. The third had positioned itself as a living barrier between Frankie and the habitat's entrance. "How did a human even get in there?" demanded Instructor Velmoth, her optical stalks extending fully in agitation. "The containment protocols were bypassed from the inside," interrupted the technician, her tendrils dancing across the holographic interface. "But not by the human, by the cubs themselves." 18 hours earlier, Frankie had been conducting routine maintenance on the station's lower decks when he'd heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the cold efficiency of the Varinthian military installation. A whimper, small, frightened, and utterly incongruous with the reputation of the creatures being trained 1 level below. He shouldn't have investigated. Maintenance workers were forbidden from the training levels, but Frankie had grown up on a farm on New Saskatchewan, and he knew the sound of a baby animal in distress the way some people knew their own names. The ventilation shaft had been easier to navigate than expected. The Varinthians, for all their military precision, had designed their station for beings much larger than the average human. Frankie squeezed through passages that would have been impossible for his employers. Following the sound of distress, he found the Krell cub wedged between 2 pieces of training equipment, its leg caught in a gap that the Varinthian staff had clearly deemed too small to be dangerous. For a Krell, perhaps, but the cubs were still growing, still clumsy with bodies that would one day become apex killing machines. "Hey there," Frankie had whispered, approaching slowly. "You're okay. Let's get you out of there." The cub had snarled, baring teeth that could already tear through flesh. Its training was already taking effect. Humans were prey. Humans were targets. Humans were weak things to be eliminated. But Frankie didn't smell like fear. He smelled like grease and recycled air and something else. Something the cub's instincts recognized from before the training, before the conditioning. He smelled like the beings who had cared for them in their earliest days, before being transferred to the Varinthians. He smelled like patience. I know, Frankie had murmured, pulling a protein bar from his pocket and breaking off a piece. "Everything's scary when you're stuck. But we're going to fix this, okay?" It took 30 minutes to carefully widen the gap enough to free the cub's leg. The young Krell hadn't stopped growling the entire time, but it also hadn't attacked. And when Frankie had checked the leg for breaks, running careful hands over the joint while making soft, reassuring sounds, the cub had gone very still. "There you go," Frankie had said finally, sitting back. "Nothing broken. You'll be fine." The cub had stared at him with eyes that held a predator's intelligence and a child's confusion. Then it had done something that would later be analyzed by xenobiologists across 3 sectors. It had chirped, a sound Krell made only with their own parents in their dens when they were safe. Frankie had smiled and offered another piece of protein bar. The other 2 cubs had found them an hour later. By then, Frankie had committed so many violations of station protocol that he'd stopped counting. The cubs should have attacked on sight. Their training demanded it. Instead, they'd approached cautiously, drawn by their siblings' unusual contentment. Frankie had food. More importantly, Frankie had something the Varinthian training regime had never included: gentleness. He'd scratched behind the first cub's auditory ridges, the place that itched as their adult plates began to grow in. He'd checked the second cub's paw when it favored its left side, finding and removing a small piece of metal lodged between the pads. He'd spoken to them in soft, meaningless sounds that nevertheless communicated safety, patience, care. When exhaustion finally claimed him, Frankie had simply leaned back against the rock and closed his eyes. If the cubs were going to kill him, he was too tired to run anyway. They hadn't killed him. They'd curled up around him instead, responding to something deeper than training, older than warfare, an instinct that recognized pack, that understood protection, that knew when a being meant no harm. "What do we do?" Velmoth asked finally, watching as Frankie stirred in his sleep and one of the cubs adjusted its position to pillow his head more comfortably. "Commander." Zaxthar's plates rippled in a pattern that might have been respect or might have been resignation. "We do what we should have done before we tried to turn infants into weapons," he said quietly. "We learn." Below them, Frankie woke slowly, hand automatically moving to scratch the nearest cub's scales. The cub rumbled contentment and its siblings pressed closer. The Varinthians had taught the apex cubs every weakness in human anatomy. But they'd forgotten to teach them that humans could be kind, that humans could be gentle, that humans could love things that were supposed to kill them. It was, Zaxthar reflected, perhaps the most dangerous human trait of all.